The King's Torah, a settler rabbi, publishes the complete guide to killing Gentiles who threaten Israel, including children and babies. Are such calls harmless, or do they drive official policy and manipulate the masses? And what about calls for extremism among the Palestinians? Religious extremism among the occupier and the occupied, and the damage done to peace prospects. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. Religion plays a large part in Israel's claims to the land it lies on and Palestinian hopes for statehood. Now, is the role of religion going too far amongst the faithful in Israel, complicating an already seemingly intractable political conflict? Jackie Rowland has more on a book that suggests that this may be the case.
The settlement of Yitzhar in the north of the occupied West Bank. Behind the fences and watchtowers live more than 500 Orthodox Jews. There are a number of religious schools here where boys and young men study the Bible and other religious books under the guidance of local rabbis. One of them is Rabbi Yitzhak Shapira, seen here on the front page of an Israeli daily newspaper. The rabbi has provoked a storm of controversy by publishing a new book in which he appears to authorize the killing of non-Jews who are accused of posing a threat to Israel. The book, called The King's Torah, contains quotations from the Talmud, a scholarly Jewish text, to which the rabbi adds his own opinions and interpretations. In a chapter entitled The Killing of Gentiles in Wartime, the rabbi writes, "In any circumstances where the presence of a Gentile causes danger to Israel, it is permitted to kill the Gentile." In addition, he says, in cases where there is a strong suspicion that someone will continue persecuting Jews, it is permissible to kill him, even if at this moment he is not actively persecuting. But other rabbis disagree with Shapira's interpretation of the Talmud, and they are dismissive of his book.
There are 7 commandments that govern the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. For example, you shall not kill, you shall not drink blood. The Talmud says that anyone who does not obey should be erased from the world. But that's just a saying. It doesn't mean that you should wake up in the morning, catch the first Arab that you see, and stab him.
However, some prominent rabbis have recommended this controversial book to their students and followers. The question now is how influential it will be and whether any Jews will act on its teachings. Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, Jerusalem.
Now, this isn't a one-sided battle. Just like the rabbis and their controversial teachings, some Islamist leaders have been accused of airing their extremist ideologies. Many use the Friday prayers as a platform to do so. In addition, TV channels are also known to air radical material. Last year, a children's TV show made headlines. One of its most infamous scenes involved a Mickey Mouse look-alike being beaten to death by an Israeli. Well, joining us today are our guests in Jerusalem, Rabbi Yahiel Graneman from Rabbis for Human Rights. Also in Jerusalem, Gerald Steinberg, Director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Bar Ilan University. And in Beirut, columnist and Middle East analyst Lamis Andoni. Thank you all of you for joining us. Gerald Steinberg, if I could start off with you, and just a quote from this book by Rabbi Shapira. He says, "There is justification for killing babies if it is clear that they will grow up to harm us." That's pretty frightening stuff, isn't it?
It's clear that extremism and violence breeds more extremism and violence. The vast majority of Israelis abhor these kinds of statements, but they also hear not only the images that you just showed from Palestinian television and the type of incitement, but they also hear statements like in the Hamas Charter. And let's remember, we're talking about a rabbi in a very fringe part of Israel. You have another guest who's a member of Rabbis for Human Rights. I hope they're also a group called Imam for Human Rights in various other Arab countries among Palestinians. But we also see in the Hamas Charter statements like Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them until the Jews hide behind rocks, and trees which will cry, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." This is a interpretation or a quote from the Quran, and this is not something from a very fringe organization. We've seen this terrible scenes of Israelis being killed in buses, children being blown up, and that does breed extremism. So I think it is very important that we don't just talk about one very fringe and very frightening response to that, but we see this in the context of the conflict and the absolute need to condemn condemn this on all sides and not just focus on one particular example of this that in fact has absolutely no foothold or reflection in the vast majority of Israelis.
You say there's no reflection and no foothold, but what about the fact that there's strong evidence that this type of theology has penetrated the Israeli army as well in the build-up to the Gaza war? These pamphlets that were distributed and endorsed by the army's chief rabbi, Brigadier General Avichai Ronsky. Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights group, says the material given to soldiers during the Gaza war, quote, contained messages bordering on racist incitement against the Palestinian people and might have encouraged soldiers to ignore international law. This is not merely just a fringe movement, is it? It does affect what's happening on the ground.
No, in fact it is. In fact, the evidence that you cited is very much shows that it's a fringe movement. Yesh Din is also very much, you're talking about a handful of people that have a very strong ideological agenda. They're funded by European governments. What they say really is not reflected in reality. What the Israeli military did was in response to 8,000 rockets and missiles. We saw the terrible scenes of Israeli civilians being killed, hit on fire by rockets coming from Gaza. All of those things, Israel didn't initiate that aggression. The Israeli army went in after a long time and effort to try to end all of that. This has not penetrated the Israeli army at all. And I think that it really is a disservice and an extreme exaggeration of what goes on to put those kinds of images out there, because what it does is it justifies more and more Palestinian, Arab, Al-Qaeda, Sunni, Shia extremism and violence. So let's put this exactly where it should be. This is a very much of a fringe movement. It's not reflected in mainstream Jewish teaching. We don't have midrasas where children are taught to kill, to hate. None of those things are there. And to try to use those images to say, well, the Jews have them, the Israelis have them too, is really, really adding to the fuel, adding to the fire, adding to the hatred, adding to the violence. We have much more of this than we can possibly handle already.
Rabbi Yehiel Greneman, Gerald Steinberg seems to be in denial that this is a factor at all. What do you think?
Well, I do agree that this particular yeshiva in Yitzhar represents a small number of people. But what you mentioned about the Israeli army during the Gaza war and things I see on the ground, things that people say amongst the settlers, tells me that it's a serious problem. I see this as a distortion of Judaism, but you know, we did have a prime minister of this country murdered by someone who came from a society in which some of this ideology was prevalent, Din Rodef, and so on.
Let's go to Lamis Andoni. Lamis, there were some accusations made by Gerald Steinberg, and we also listed some of the religious rhetoric and some of the things taught to Palestinians, particularly Palestinian children, at the beginning of the program. Dressing up the resistance in purely religious terms, has that hurt Palestinian aspirations? Has that harmed their cause?
First of all, resistance to the Israeli occupation and the Israeli continued dispossession of the Palestinians has started long before Hamas was established. This phenomena is new, but it's not as prevalent as your guest has been implying. This is not asymmetric. It's an asymmetrical situation. Even Hamas is a product of the occupation, is a product of Israeli occupation and dispossession and continued and systematic dislocation and uprooting of the Palestinians. Hamas itself, although it has a religious ideology, it's mainly a resistance movement that is built on its land. These are the indigenous people being occupied by a government that promotes an ideology and practices an ideology that promotes and practices occupation, dehumanization, uprooting of people, destroying people's lives. And Hamas came about as a result of that and not as a result of religious extremism. So let's not be confusing issues here.
But Lamis, dehumanization and occupation may well help us understand what gives rise to extremism within Palestinian society, but that doesn't mean it can be condoned. Is there enough being done to condemn things like Friday preachers saying Jews are the offspring of apes and swines and horrific things like that?
Yes, among in the Palestinian intelligentsia and newspapers, there's a more, I don't want to say secular line, because if you have a religious ideology, it doesn't mean that you have to have an exclusionary ideology and a racist ideology. Yes, maybe there's more to be done, but this is, Palestinians cannot do much to eradicate such thoughts as long as there are Israeli governments who are destroying the lives of the Palestinian people. Even secular Israeli leaders who are not necessarily that religious have practiced and have advocated disregard for Palestinian human life. So in order for the Palestinian society to eradicate such extremism, we have to solve the core of the problem, which is occupation and uprooting of Palestinians. And I'm not talking about the past, we're talking about the present. This yeshiva is in a settlement. The settlement is the symbol of Israeli aggression. It's the symbol of continued Israeli aggression and the destruction of Palestinian lives. So we cannot, the Palestinians cannot do enough, cannot do much without a real solution to the real problem. And the peace process has all failed. And instead of reaching a solution that eradicates and ends the occupation, it has consolidated the occupation and has strengthened the settlers movement, has strengthened the extremists, and has provided cover for such talk and such racism.
Rabbi Greneman, I saw you nodding in agreement there.
I pretty much agreed with my colleague there in Lebanon in her analysis. I want to say, I think it's very important to say this, that our work on the ground leads us to meet Palestinians who very clearly want peace and abhorred by extremists in their camp. And the behavior of these people in Yitzhar and places like Chavat Gilad is not insignificant in the lives of the Palestinians there. These people terrorize the surrounding population, not only during the olive harvest, but that's the worst time, destroying property. And there is, unfortunately, and we try and counter this, elements in the army which cooperate with them. These settlements are supplied with army guards that protect them. I understand that there has been terrorism, but we would all be much better off if people like this particular rabbi and his friends were inside Israel, on the other side of the Green Line, and preferably in jail.
Gerald Steinberg, what seems to be the common thread amongst the argument of both our other speakers is that in explaining the extremism on both sides, the common thread seems to be an institutional racism from Israel and the occupation. Would you disagree with that?
Well, I think Rabbi Greneman has a very deep desire to change reality. He really thinks that if only Israel were completely better, not 90%, but 100% perfect, Messianic Judaism, it's a form of Messianism, and he has his own, as the few of his colleagues do, this Messianic belief. Unfortunately, of course, the reality is very different. The real problem here is denial of reality. And part of that reality is a religious extremism that started long before 1967. Lamis she used the word occupation about 100 times, and that's clearly her message, and she doesn't really care about this religious extremism because she didn't really address it.
So what are you saying? Are you saying the West Bank is not under occupation?
No. Well, I think that what we should do is acknowledge that the history did not start in 1967, and the occupation, as you call it, and all the settlements, and the conflict started much earlier, and that is a religious part of the conflict. Let's not deny that. In 1947, when the United Nations offered and suggested and proposed and tried to get partition, two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, all of the Jewish leadership accepted it, including the rabbis, everybody, even though it was very painful because Jews do see this land as part of the Holy Land. They were willing to compromise like King Solomon did. But it was the Arab leadership that said across the board, no, the Jews can't have sovereignty. It's that religious extremism. It's those quotes in the Quran which also need to be dealt with. It's the lines in the Hamas charter that need to be dealt with. It was Yasser Arafat, ostensibly a leader of a secular movement, who long before 1967 would begin his fiery speeches about throwing the Jews into the sea by quoting lines from the Quran. And we all heard those things. Now, maybe the rabbi doesn't remember that, but I do.
Well, let's look at the other side of this.
Really shouldn't be
let's
in
look at the
denial.
other side of this. Let's look at the other side of this. Lamis, come in,
Excuse me,
Lamis.
this is the whole this is real distortion. Arafat has never said that. You have to check your facts. Secondly, yes, I do agree
have different facts.
that the conflict did start before 1967. The dispossession and uprooting of the Palestinians, the systematic Israeli effort to eradicate the Palestinian identity has not started in 1967. This you are right. And the movement led by Yasser Arafat and people after him was not motivated by religious fervor or ideology. It was a national liberation movement. A national liberation movement.
I wonder if do you accept the right of the Jewish people to national sovereignty? Do you accept the right of the Jewish people to national sovereignty in any boundaries whatsoever? Yes or no? That's the question. If you say yes, then the religious aspect can be dealt with. If you say no, it's racism and discrimination.
Well, I think the Palestinians have a right to decide for themselves. Lamis, you don't really have to answer that. Gerald, another thing I want to bring in here.
That's the major issue.
Gerald, you bring in the idea that it's institutional from the Palestinian perspective, but any extremism is fringe from the Israeli perspective. What about Judge Major Adrian Agassi, responsible for sending hundreds of Palestinians into administrative detention without trial, expropriating Palestinian land in the West Bank for settlements? He said in an interview last month with a British newspaper, quote, "The ancient land of Israel is given to us by the Bible, not by some United Nations." This is a man who doesn't want peace, Gerald. How can Israel afford to have people like that in leadership positions?
Other than this quote that you're reading out of context, partially and translated, have you ever spoken to Major Agassi? Maybe you should speak to him, because I think what you've done is you've taken a position which is complex, which, like many, many other people in the Middle East, extending all the way out to Afghanistan and Iraq, and including Jewish people, we have a religion. And unless that religion is recognized as legitimate as much as any other religion, what you're going to continue to do is produce extremism and distortion. And what you've just done is a classic example.
Rabbi Graneman, have I distorted what Judge Major Adrian Agassi said, that the ancient land of Israel is given to us by the Bible, not by some United Nations, which leads him to order the eviction of Palestinians in the West Bank and build settlements?
No, there's no distortion there. Not only that, it's not an uncommon attitude amongst Israelis to look at the there's a famous quote, Shmum, to look at the UN as a negative, as a antagonistic institution. And I think that quite a few Israelis will tell you that the reason that they're in the land of Israel is because of the Bible. I would agree with that. I do think people who want compromise and prefer life to continuing bloodshed are not messianic. I think there's nothing more human and realistic than wanting to find a way to live together here rather than carrying on an ideology which is supremacist or racist. And unfortunately, it pains me to admit this, Yitzhar is maybe the most extreme, but there is not a little racism in Israeli society, something I'd like to see changed. I don't think this is about perfection. I think it's about being human beings, or what we call in Yiddish, Menschen. A mensch, you know.
Before we wrap
relating to the other in your midst in a human way, in a dignified way.
What about the Palestinian side of
Israel uses, as you said, administrative detention. There is torture. There are many, many serious human rights abuses, including abuses of the rights of settlers. I have to admit, the way the border guards sometimes beat up settlers when they move them off their illegal outposts to me, is a consequence of the continuing occupation and the brutality that it's led to in Israeli society.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to broaden this out a little bit. There's a few minutes left. We've talked about religious extremism within the confines of Israel and Palestine. But what happens when extreme opinions are held by individuals and governments outside the region? Influential religious leader, the late Reverend Jerry Falwell, was quoted as saying, "Regardless of the response from the Jewish person, we remain friends in support of the State of Israel as required by Scripture." Many evangelical Christians believe it's their religious duty to support Jews and therefore Israel. This has had serious implications on the politics of the most powerful negotiator in the Middle East peace process, the USA. After George Bush's very narrow win in the 2001 presidential elections, his campaign declared their intention to harness the vote of the Christian right in the next election. During his presidency, the USA built its warmest relationship with Israel of any US regime. Well, in 2004, George Bush won with a 4 million vote majority. It's believed many of these could be attributed to evangelical Christians. I want to bring Lami Sindoni in for this unequivocal support for Israel amongst a strong constituency and the most powerful nation on earth. That surely can't help things, can it?
You're talking about a very right-wing constituency, which unfortunately is considerable. And we saw what happened when there was an alliance of that constituency of right-wing evangelical Christians, which we call Zionist Christians, but they're really extremists, and the Israeli extremists. It was a catastrophic, not just only for the Palestinians, for the world. That alliance that produced Bush, which really had not only disregard for the Palestinians, but for the Iraqis and the Afghans and the rest of the world, because they were driven by a superior God-given right to rule the world, and and also give, it's a cynical, actually, I don't believe it's all religious, it's a manipulation of people who follow the evangelical preachers. It's a manipulation of the public in order to consolidate the power of people who benefit truly, profit-wise and power-wise, from invasions and from the military industry. And that gave a lot of support and actually bolstered the right wing in Israel. And when Obama came, and I'm not praising Obama here, it's just when Obama came, there was a backlash because they were afraid that they would lose that support. And I think what's happening now, these kinds of ideas are not in isolation, and not only of the Gaza war, but also of the Goldstone report, and how Israel is afraid of the Goldstone report, so people are reacting. It's also a reaction to the fury in the world against the settlements. So these ideas come now to justify these Israeli policies and to manipulate the public into accepting them.
Okay, there's less than a minute left on the program. We need a response from Gerald. Gerald Steinberg?
The Christian community is very much divided. There's a very strong, very harsh, almost anti-Semitic part of Christianity. Groups like Christian Aid campaign constantly for the type of propaganda that we just heard from Lamis, blaming it all on Israel. We're 6 million Jews in this area. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims. The basic cause of the conflict is racism, intolerance, and an unwillingness to look at the reality here. The vast majority of Israelis are much closer to the positions that I and the rabbi hold and others. We are not violent people, but we do want to live in peace. By this kind of very, very inciting rhetoric, the kind of hatred that we hear over and over again, the unwillingness to accept the legitimacy of 4,000 years of Jewish history as part of this area, we're never going to end this conflict. And that's what I do not hear from Lamis. I do not hear from people like Lamis, from the International Solidarity Movement, from all these other organizations.
Okay, Gerald, we've run out of time.
A clear statement that says we have to accept Jewish rights here as well as other rights.
Okay. That wraps it up. Gerald Steinberg, Lami Sindoni, and Rabbi Yahyel Greneman, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Bye-bye for now.